I found his son alone downstairs on a cold November evening, curled up beneath the grand staircase like some forgotten secret. The silence was deafening. No laughter, no footsteps, just the quiet sobbing of a child abandoned in a house full of people. It wasn't just loneliness, it was neglect wrapped in silk sheets and perfume. Maybe you're taking care of children whose parents never notice your efforts, or cleaning up while the house is quiet. Tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? I promise today's story will touch your heart. My name is Claudia, and I'm 58 years old. My hands have folded countless tiny clothes, my ears have listened to lullabies sung softly into the night, and my heart has carried the weight of loving children who were never truly mine. The scent of baby powder still clings to my memory like an old perfume, mixing with the smell of fresh coffee I'd brew before dawn and the lavender lotion I'd rub on tiny hands before bedtime. That November evening in Chicago, the Gold Coast mansion stood like a monument to wealth and indifference. The marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers worth more than most people's homes, but they couldn't warm the coldness that had settled into every corner of that house. I wore my navy blue uniform, pressed, spotless, invisible. The same one I'd worn for 6 years, moving through those halls like a ghost in sensible shoes. The wind off Lake Michigan rattled the tall windows, and I could hear it whistling through the gaps in my heart, too. That's when I found Mason, Richard's 7-year-old son, trembling beneath the mahogany banister like a lost puppy. His Spider-Man pajamas were wrinkled, his dark hair tousled from tears, and his green eyes, so much like his father's, were rimmed with the kind of sadness that breaks you from the inside out. I knelt beside him, my knees creaking the way they do when you've spent decades caring for everyone but yourself. The Persian rug beneath us probably cost more than I made in 3 months, but all I could think about was this little boy who'd been forgotten in his own home. When I first walked through those gleaming doors 6 years ago, I thought I was stepping into a fairy tale. Richard Hampton was one of Chicago's most successful real estate moguls, with a portfolio worth hundreds of millions of dollars in investments that stretched from downtown skyscrapers to Bitcoin ventures that made headlines in the Tribune. His wealth seemed endless: stock market gains, dividend payments, and a business empire that generated more money in a month than I'd see in a lifetime. But money, I learned, can't buy a father's attention or a stepmother's genuine love. I was 42 then, recently divorced, with my own daughter Sarah already grown and living in California. The agency told me I was exactly what the family needed: experienced, discreet, professional. They didn't mention I'd also need to be a magician, making myself invisible while somehow filling every emotional gap in that house. Richard had remarried just 6 months before I arrived. Veronica was 28. A former model turned socialite with platinum blonde hair and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She moved through that mansion like she owned it, which legally she partly did after their wedding. But she moved around Mason like he was an obstacle to navigate rather than a child to nurture. Those early days with Mason were the sweetest torture I'd ever known. He was 4 then, still small enough to climb into my lap when nightmares visited, still young enough to believe that if he loved hard enough, maybe the adults around him would love him back the same way. I'd watch him playing with his toy cars on the Persian rugs, making engine noises that echoed through empty rooms, while his father worked 18-hour days downtown and his stepmother shopped on Michigan Avenue with money that flowed like water. I gave Mason everything I had. When he woke up crying at 2 a.m, I was there, humming "You Are My Sunshine," until his breathing steadied. When he scraped his knee learning to ride his bike in Lincoln Park, I kissed it better and painted cartoon bandages on his other knee so they'd match. When he started kindergarten at the exclusive private academy his father's donations had helped build, I was the one who walked him to the door, promised I'd be there when he got home, and meant it with every fiber of my being. But love, I was learning, wasn't always enough to break through walls built from ambition and indifference. The mansion itself was a masterpiece of architecture and isolation. 15 rooms spread across 4 floors, each one decorated with the kind of taste that money could buy, but warmth couldn't touch. The kitchen was all granite and stainless steel, designed more for catering staff during Richard's business dinners than for a child who just wanted someone to share cookies and milk with him after school. The living room showcased art worth more than most people's houses, but Mason wasn't allowed to touch anything, to leave fingerprints on the glass coffee table or crayon marks on the walls. My own room was on the 3rd floor, small but comfortable, with a window that looked out over the neighbors' gardens. I'd furnished it with my own things: photos of Sarah, a quilt my mother had made, books I'd read and reread when the loneliness became too heavy to bear. It was the only space in that house that felt like home, and even then I knew I was just a tenant whose lease could be terminated at any moment. The loneliness in that house was like a living thing, feeding on silence and growing stronger every day. Richard would come home after the stock market closed, his phone still buzzing with business calls about property acquisitions and investment portfolios. He'd ruffle Mason's hair absently, ask if he'd been good, and then disappear into his study with a glass of whiskey and spreadsheets that held more of his attention than his son ever would. Veronica treated me like expensive furniture, necessary but not worth acknowledging unless something needed to be moved or cleaned. She'd sweep through the kitchen in her designer workout clothes, grab a bottled water from the refrigerator that cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget, and leave without a word. If Mason tried to show her a drawing he'd made or tell her about his day, she'd smile that plastic smile and say, "That's nice, honey, but Mommy has a spa appointment." The word mommy always made my stomach clench. Mason's real mother had died in a car accident when he was 2, too young to remember her face, but old enough to feel the absence like a phantom limb that would never stop aching. Veronica wore the title like a piece of jewelry, beautiful and expensive, but ultimately meaningless. I watched Mason learn to stop reaching for affection from people who had none to give. I watched him learn to come to me instead, and while my heart soared every time he chose my lap over the emptiness of that vast living room, it also broke a little more. I was giving him Band-Aids for wounds that needed surgery, love that could sustain him but never quite heal him. The holidays were the hardest. That first Christmas, I spent weeks helping Mason make paper ornaments and construction paper cards for his father and stepmother. His little fingers worked so carefully, tongue poking out in concentration as he drew stick figures and wrote, "I love you," in crayon letters that wandered across the page like his uncertain heart. Richard glanced at the card during dinner, smiled briefly, and set it aside to deal with a phone call about a commercial real estate deal in the Loop. Veronica held hers for exactly 3 seconds before placing it on the counter next to a stack of bills, where it would eventually be thrown away with the junk mail and takeout menus. I kept every card Mason ever made me, treasured every drawing of the two of us holding hands under a smiling sun. They're still in a box in my apartment now, yellow with age but precious as gold certificates or stock options. The microaggressions came in waves, small cuts that individually seemed manageable, but collectively bled me dry. Veronica would forget to include me in staff meal plans during their dinner parties, leaving me to eat crackers in my room while caterers served $100-a-plate dinners downstairs. She'd schedule her friends' children for playdates without telling me, then act annoyed when Mason's schedule conflicted with activities I'd planned. She'd move my things, my coffee cup from the kitchen counter, my magazines from the living room table, just enough to remind me that I didn't really belong anywhere in that house. The worst part was how she'd do it all with that sweet smile, the one she'd perfected during her modeling days. "Oh, Claudia, I hope you don't mind, but I've invited the Hendersons' daughter over for Mason to play with. You understand how important these social connections are for his future, don't you?" As if I was too simple to understand that networking started in kindergarten for families like theirs. Richard was oblivious to most of it, lost in his world of profit margins and property values. When I tried to bring up concerns about Mason's emotional needs, he'd nod absently and promise we'd discuss it later, but later never came. He was always rushing off to another meeting, another deal, another opportunity to turn his hundreds of millions into billions. But Mason saw everything. Children always do. He started having nightmares more frequently, waking up crying for his real mommy, the one he'd never really known but somehow missed, with an intensity that scared me. He'd cling to me during those dark hours, and I'd rock him back to sleep, humming lullabies and wondering how adults could be so blind to the damage they were causing. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in March, during Mason's 6th birthday party. Veronica had planned an elaborate celebration. A magician, a petting zoo in the backyard, enough decorations to stock a party supply warehouse. The guest list read like a who's who of Chicago's elite families. Children whose trust funds outweighed their ages. Parents more interested in networking than celebrating. I'd spent weeks planning special touches for Mason. His favorite chocolate cake recipe, passed down from my grandmother, a treasure hunt with clues written in the secret code we'd developed together, a photo album of all our adventures over the past 2 years. I thought I was part of the team, part of the celebration for the little boy I loved like my own. The morning of the party, Veronica pulled me aside with that smile that never reached her eyes. "Claudia, I know you've put a lot of effort into Mason's party, and we appreciate that, we really do. But I think it would be best if you stayed upstairs during the celebration. You understand? It's important for Mason to learn to socialize with his peers without depending on you so much. We don't want him to seem, well, too attached to the help." The help. 2 words that slice through 6 years of love and dedication like a blade through tissue paper. I stood there in my birthday party dress. Nothing fancy, just a simple blue dress I'd bought specifically for Mason's special day, and felt every ounce of my worth drain away through the marble floors. I nodded, smiled, and retreated to my room like the good employee I was supposed to be. Through my window, I could see Mason in the backyard, looking around frantically, probably wondering where I was. I watched him search the faces of the adults, all of them strangers in expensive clothes who'd brought expensive presents but no real affection. I watched him realize I wasn't coming, watched his little shoulders slump in a way that made my chest feel like it was collapsing. That night, after the guests had gone home and the caterers had cleaned up, Mason climbed the stairs to my room. He was still wearing his party clothes, but his face was streaked with tears and disappointment. "Why weren't you at my party, Miss Claudia?" he whispered, crawling into my lap like he had when he was smaller. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that sometimes love isn't enough? That sometimes the people who should protect you are the ones who hurt you the most? I held him close, breathing in the scent of his strawberry shampoo mixed with birthday cake, and wondered how much more of this either of us could take. The seasons changed, and so did the dynamics in that house. Richard's business empire continued to grow, new investments in cryptocurrency that made headlines, real estate developments that changed Chicago's skyline, stock portfolios that fluctuated by millions daily. But success in the markets didn't translate to success as a father. If anything, the more wealthy he became, the more distant he grew from Mason. Veronica, meanwhile, had found her rhythm as the wealthy widow-turned-socialite. She joined charity boards, organized fundraisers, appeared in society pages wearing clothes that cost more than I made in 6 months. She was building her own empire of influence and connections, and Mason was increasingly seen as an inconvenience, a reminder of Richard's previous life that didn't fit the narrative she was crafting. I watched it all from the margins. Invisible but essential, present but excluded. I was the one who knew Mason's favorite bedtime story, who remembered that he was scared of thunderstorms, who noticed when he was getting sick before anyone else. I was the keeper of his childhood in a house where childhood was increasingly unwelcome. The isolation was crushing. My own daughter, Sarah, called less frequently, frustrated by my devotion to a job that seemed to be slowly killing my spirit. "Mom, "You're wasting your life on people who don't appreciate you," she'd say during our Sunday phone calls. "Come to California. Help me with my kids. Be a real grandmother instead of pretending to be a mother to that wealthy family's child." But how could I leave Mason? How could I abandon the one person in that mansion who truly needed me? Every time I considered it, I'd remember the way he'd reach for my hand during scary movies, or how he'd save me the last bite of his favorite cookie, or the way he'd whisper, "I love you," when he thought no one else was listening. These moments were golden threads holding my heart together, even as everything else unraveled. The summer Mason turned 7 was particularly difficult. Richard decided to take the family on a European vacation, first-class flights to Paris, 5-star hotels, private tours of museums and chateaux. I assumed I'd be going too, to help with Mason during the long flights and busy days of sightseeing. 2 days before departure, Veronica informed me that my services wouldn't be needed. "We've hired a local au pair in Paris," she said, not looking up from her magazine. "It's time Mason learned to be more independent. Besides, the hotel rooms are quite expensive, and we thought you might enjoy some time to yourself." Time to myself, in an empty mansion, while the little boy I'd raised spent 2 weeks with strangers in a foreign country. I called Richard at his office, something I'd never done before. His secretary put me through, though I could hear the hesitation in her voice. "Claudia, what's wrong? Is Mason okay?" "Mason's fine, Mr. Hampton, but I'm concerned about the Paris trip. Mason's never been away from me for more than a day. He gets anxious with new people and—" "Claudia," Richard interrupted, his voice taking on that businesslike tone he used when closing deals. "Veronica and I discussed this. Mason needs to learn independence. He's been too sheltered, too dependent. This trip will be good for him." Too sheltered, too dependent, as if love was a weakness to be overcome rather than a foundation to be built upon. They left on a Wednesday morning. I helped Mason pack his suitcase, folding his favorite pajamas and tucking in the stuffed elephant he'd had since he was a toddler. He was excited about the airplane and seeing the Eiffel Tower, but I could see the anxiety in his eyes. "Miss Claudia, will you be here when I get back?" he asked, his small hand gripping mine. "Of course, sweetheart. I'll be right here waiting for you." It was a promise I meant with every fiber of my being, though I had no way of knowing then how difficult it would be to keep. The 2 weeks they were gone were the longest of my life. I rattled around that 15-room mansion like a marble in an empty jar, surrounded by luxury but suffocating in loneliness. I cleaned rooms that were already spotless, organized closets that were already perfect, and tried to convince myself that this was just a temporary separation, that things would go back to normal when they returned. I was wrong. The family that came back from Paris was different. Mason seemed smaller somehow, more withdrawn. The light in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by a wariness that broke my heart. Veronica glowed with the confidence of someone who'd proven a point. And Richard seemed more distant than ever, as if the success of managing Mason without me had convinced him that I was less necessary than he'd previously thought. The changes were subtle at first. Veronica began scheduling more activities for Mason that didn't require my involvement: tennis lessons at the country club, play dates with other wealthy families' children, art classes at the cultural center downtown. She'd arrange these during times when I was supposed to be caring for him, then act surprised when I pointed out the conflict. "Oh, I thought you could use the break," she'd say with that practiced sweetness. "You work so hard and Mason's getting older. He doesn't need constant supervision anymore." But Mason did need me, maybe more than ever. The trauma of being separated from me during the Paris trip, of being handed off to strangers in a foreign country, had left invisible scars. He started wetting the bed again, something he hadn't done since he was 4. He had difficulty sleeping, often padding down to the kitchen in the middle of the night to look for me. He became clingy during the times we were together, as if he was afraid I might disappear again. I tried to address these concerns with Richard, but he was busier than ever. His investment portfolio was demanding more of his attention. The cryptocurrency market was volatile, requiring constant monitoring, and a major real estate development project was running into zoning issues that required his personal involvement. He'd come home exhausted, snap at Mason for minor infractions, and retreat to his study with a glass of whiskey and spreadsheets. The night I found Mason beneath the staircase was the culmination of weeks of increasing neglect and isolation. It was a Tuesday evening in November, the wind off Lake Michigan howling through the bare trees that lined their street. Richard was at a business dinner with potential investors, Veronica was at a charity gala, and I was supposed to be off duty. But I could never really be off duty when it came to Mason. Something in my heart pulled me downstairs, some maternal instinct that had been honed over 6 years of loving that little boy. I found him curled up in his Spider-Man pajamas beneath the grand mahogany staircase, sobbing quietly in the shadows cast by the crystal chandelier above. "Mason, baby, what's wrong?" I whispered, sinking to my knees beside him despite the protest of my aging joints. He threw his arms around my neck, clinging to me like I was his lifeline in a storm-tossed sea. "Miss Claudia, I had a bad dream and nobody came. I called for Daddy, but he's not here. I called for Veronica, but she didn't answer. I was so scared, and nobody came except you." My heart shattered into 1,000 pieces, each shard cutting deeper than the last. This little boy, surrounded by millions of dollars in assets and investments, living in a house worth more than most people could imagine, was emotionally bankrupt. He was rich in everything that didn't matter, and poor in the only thing that did. I held him close, feeling his small body shaking with sobs, and made a decision that would change everything. I couldn't keep pretending that my love was enough to compensate for his parents' neglect. I couldn't keep enabling a system that was slowly destroying the sweetest child I'd ever known. That night, I tucked Mason into bed and sang him to sleep with "You Are My Sunshine," the same song I'd been humming to chase away his nightmares for 3 years. But as I watched him finally drift off, his small hand clutching mine, I knew that something fundamental had shifted. I couldn't continue to be his only source of love and stability while pretending that was acceptable. The next morning, I asked Richard for a private meeting. He agreed, though I could see the impatience in his eyes as he glanced at his phone, probably checking stock prices or reading updates from his business manager. "Mr. Hampton, I need to talk to you about Mason," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. "What about him? Has he been acting out again?" Veronica mentioned he's been more difficult lately. Difficult? As if seeking love and attention was a character flaw to be corrected rather than a basic human need to be fulfilled. "Mason isn't difficult, sir. Mason is lonely. He's scared. He's a 7-year-old boy who needs his father's attention and affection, and he's not getting either." Richard's jaw tightened, and I could see the defensive walls going up. "Claudia, I provide very well for my son. He has everything he could possibly want. The best schools, the finest clothes, every toy and opportunity money can buy. But he doesn't have you," I said quietly. "He doesn't have a father who comes to his school, plays or knows his favorite color, or remembers that he's afraid of thunderstorms. Money won't fix what's broken in that little boy's heart." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Richard stood up from behind his mahogany desk, straightening his tie in a gesture I'd seen him make hundreds of times when he was uncomfortable. "Claudia, I think you're overstepping your boundaries. You're Mason's nanny, not his mother. Perhaps you've become too emotionally involved." Too emotionally involved? The same accusation thrown at every woman who dared to love someone else's child as if it were her own, who gave her heart without reservation, because that's what children needed to thrive. "Maybe I am too involved," I admitted. "Maybe I care too much about a little boy who deserves better than what he's getting. But somebody has to care, Mr. Hampton. Somebody has to love him like he matters." Richard's face flushed red. And for a moment, I thought he might fire me on the spot. Instead, he walked to the window that overlooked Lincoln Park, his hands clasped behind his back in a pose I'd seen him strike during difficult business negotiations. "My relationship with my son is not your concern," he said finally. "Your job is to care for his physical needs and ensure his safety. His emotional development is a family matter." Family matter. I'd been caring for Mason for 6 years, loved him through sleepless nights and fevered days, celebrated every milestone and comforted every disappointment, but I wasn't family. I was just the help. I left that meeting feeling like I'd been hollowed out with a spoon, scraped clean of hope and dignity. But I also felt a strange sense of relief. I'd finally spoken the truth, even if it fell on deaf ears. I'd advocated for Mason, even if it cost me my job security. Sometimes love requires you to risk everything, even when you're almost certain you'll lose. The retaliation began immediately, though it came through Veronica rather than Richard directly. My hours were cut back. I was no longer needed for breakfast duty or bedtime stories. My responsibilities were reduced to basic childcare during the day, while Mason was home from school. Veronica hired an evening babysitter, a perky college student who didn't know that Mason was lactose intolerant or that he had nightmares about dinosaurs. I watched from the margins as Mason struggled with the changes. He'd look for me during dinner, confused when I wasn't there to cut his food or remind him to eat his vegetables. He'd call for me during the night when bad dreams visited, only to find a stranger sitting in the hallway reading magazines instead of someone who knew exactly which bedtime story would chase away the monsters. The isolation was devastating, but what hurt even more was watching Mason withdraw further into himself. He stopped drawing pictures for me, stopped sharing stories about his day at school, stopped reaching for my hand when we walked through Lincoln Park. It was as if he was learning at 7 years old that love was conditional and temporary, that the people who claimed to care about him would eventually leave or be taken away. My own emotional state was deteriorating rapidly. I'd lost 15 pounds since the Paris trip, barely sleeping, surviving on coffee and the occasional sandwich grabbed between Mason's activities. Sarah called more frequently, worried about the exhaustion she could hear in my voice. "Mom, this isn't healthy. You're making yourself sick over people who don't care about you. Come to California. Start over." But how could I start over when Mason was still trapped in that emotional wasteland? How could I save myself while abandoning the one person who needed me most? The answer came in December, during Mason's school Christmas pageant. I'd helped him practice his lines for weeks, listening to him recite the speech about peace and love on earth, while his own home grew colder and more fractured every day. He was playing a shepherd, and I'd spent my own money buying him a costume that would make him proud when he stood on that stage. The performance was at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday, a time when all the other parents would be there, camera phones ready, proud smiles beaming from the audience. I assumed Richard and Veronica would attend. It was Mason's first real school performance, a milestone that even the busiest parents usually prioritize. The morning of the pageant, Veronica informed me that neither she nor Richard would be able to attend. "Richard has a meeting with investors about the blockchain project," she said, not looking up from her phone. "And I have a spa appointment that I simply can't reschedule. You'll take Mason, of course." Of course. Because who else would witness his moment of triumph except the hired help who loved him? Who else would applaud when he delivered his lines perfectly and cheer when he took his bow, except the woman who wasn't supposed to get too emotionally involved? I sat in that school auditorium surrounded by mothers and fathers, grandparents and siblings, all of them beaming with pride as their children performed. Mason's eyes scanned the audience, looking for the faces that weren't there, and when he found me, his smile was both grateful and heartbreakingly sad. After the performance, the other children ran to their families, surrounded by hugs and congratulations and promises of ice cream to celebrate. Mason walked to me slowly, still wearing his shepherd costume, his face trying to hide the disappointment that radiated from every pore. "Did you see me, Miss Claudia? Did I do good?" "You were perfect, sweetheart," I told him, kneeling down to his level so he could see the honest pride in my eyes. "You were absolutely perfect." But as I held him in that crowded school hallway, watching other families celebrate together, I realized that my love alone wasn't enough anymore. Mason needed more than one person in the audience. He needed parents who showed up, who prioritized his milestones over their investment portfolios and spa appointments. He needed to feel like he mattered to the people whose DNA he carried. That night, I made a decision that terrified and liberated me in equal measure. I wrote a letter to Richard and Veronica, a carefully worded document that laid out everything I'd observed over the past 6 years. I detailed Mason's emotional needs, his behavioral changes, the impact of their neglect on his development. I included recommendations for family therapy, suggestions for improving their relationship with their son, and a timeline for implementing changes. It was the most professional way I could think of to say, "You're destroying this child, and I won't be complicit in it anymore." I left the letter on Richard's desk before I went to bed that night, knowing it would likely result in my termination but unable to remain silent any longer. Mason deserved someone who would fight for him, even if that fight cost me everything. The response came the next morning in the form of a text message. "Claudia, your services are no longer required. Please pack your belongings and leave by noon. Your final paycheck will be deposited into your account." No conversation, no opportunity to explain or defend myself, no acknowledgement of the 6 years I'd devoted to their family or the love I'd poured into their son. Just a cold, businesslike dismissal delivered through digital text, as impersonal as firing any other employee who'd outlived their usefulness. I sat in my small room on the 3rd floor, surrounded by 6 years of memories, and tried to figure out how to pack up a life. How do you fit the weight of loving someone into a suitcase? How do you fold up bedtime stories and lullabies, scraped knees kissed better, and nightmares chased away? I could hear Mason downstairs, calling for me, his voice getting more frantic as the minutes passed without an answer. Veronica's sharp voice cut through his calls. "Mason, stop yelling. Claudia is busy. Come eat your breakfast." But I wasn't busy. I was frozen, standing in the middle of my room with my hands shaking and my heart breaking, trying to figure out how to say goodbye to the child who'd become my whole world. The knock on my door came 20 minutes later, soft, tentative, followed by Mason's small voice. "Miss Claudia, can I come in?" He pushed the door open before I could answer, his green eyes taking in the suitcase on my bed, the photos being packed away, the slow dissolution of the only home he'd known me to have. His face crumpled with understanding. "Are you leaving?" he whispered. "How do you explain termination to a 7-year-old? How do you tell a child that the adults in his life have decided his happiness is less important than their pride? How do you say goodbye to someone who trusted you to never abandon them?" I knelt down and pulled him close, breathing in the scent of his strawberry shampoo one last time. "Sometimes grown-ups make decisions that don't make sense," I told him, "but I need you to remember something very important, okay? I love you. I will always love you. Nothing will ever change that. But why can't you stay? I'll be good, I promise. I won't have any more bad dreams. I won't cry anymore." The words shattered what was left of my composure. This sweet boy was blaming himself, trying to negotiate away his own emotional needs to keep me from leaving. The damage being done to his psyche was immeasurable, and I was powerless to stop it. "This isn't about you being good," I whispered fiercely. "You are the best boy in the whole world. You are smart and kind and funny and perfect exactly the way you are. Don't you ever think this is your fault?" I held him until Veronica's voice echoed up the stairs, sharp with impatience. "Mason, come down here right now." He pulled away reluctantly, his small hand lingering in mine. "Will I see you again?" The question hung in the air between us like a prayer and a threat. I wanted to promise him yes, to lie if it would make this easier, but I'd never been dishonest with Mason, and I wouldn't start now. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I hope so. I hope so with all my heart." He nodded solemnly, understanding somehow that this was the kind of goodbye that might last forever. Then he was gone, his small footsteps echoing down the hallway, leaving me alone with my suitcase and 6 years of memories. I finished packing in silence, each item that went into my bags feeling like another piece of my heart being torn away. The family photos I'd taken of Mason over the years, the Mother's Day cards he'd made me, even though I wasn't his mother. The small gifts he'd given me with his allowance, a butterfly pin from the museum shop, a bookmark with my name spelled out in wooden letters. As I carried my bags down the back stairs to avoid another scene, I could hear Mason crying in the kitchen, his sobs echoing through the marble halls like an accusation. Veronica's voice was sharp with annoyance. "Stop crying, Mason. You're too old for this behavior. Too old to cry when someone you love disappears from your life. Too old to feel abandoned when the one person who'd made you feel safe and valued is suddenly gone. Too old to be heartbroken at 7 years old." I left through the service entrance, the same way I'd entered 6 years ago, invisible, unacknowledged, carrying only what I could fit in my hands. My small Honda Civic looked ridiculous parked next to Richard's Tesla and Veronica's Mercedes, a reminder of the vast economic divide between their world and mine. As I drove away from the Gold Coast mansion for what I thought would be the last time, I could see Mason's face pressed against his bedroom window, his palm flat against the glass, like he was trying to reach through it to stop me from leaving. That image is burned into my memory like a photograph, a moment of pure heartbreak captured in perfect clarity. I spent that first week in a cheap motel near O'Hare Airport, too emotionally devastated to make any concrete plans. I'd call the agency that had placed me with the Hamptons, hoping they might have another position available, but my heart wasn't really in it. How do you start over with a new family when you're still bleeding from leaving the last one? Sarah called every day, begging me to come to California, to start fresh where the memories couldn't follow me. "Mom, you gave them 6 years of your life. You don't owe them anything more. Come help me with Emma and Jake. Be their grandmother instead of trying to replace Mason's mother." But that was just it. I hadn't been trying to replace Mason's mother. I'd been trying to fill the void left by parents who were too busy building their financial empire to notice their son was emotionally starving in the middle of their abundance. I'd been trying to love a child who desperately needed loving, and now he was alone again in that cold mansion with people who saw him as an obligation rather than a gift. The guilt was crushing. Every night, I'd lie awake wondering if Mason was having nightmares, if anyone was there to comfort him when he woke up scared and alone. I'd picture him calling for me in the darkness, only to remember that I wasn't there anymore, that I'd been removed from his life as easily as updating a stock portfolio or changing an investment strategy. 2 weeks after leaving the Hampton house, I finally found a small apartment in Rogers Park, far from the Gold Coast's luxury, but close enough to the lake that I could still smell the water that had become so familiar during my walks with Mason. It was a modest one-bedroom place with thin walls and creaky floors, but it was mine, and for the first time in 6 years, I didn't have to ask permission to exist in my own space. I tried to rebuild some semblance of a life. I applied for part-time positions with other families, but my heart wasn't in it. How do you love another child when your heart is still broken over the one you had to leave behind? How do you invest emotionally in a new family when you're still grieving the loss of the old one? The loneliness was profound, but it was different from the isolation I'd experienced in the Hampton household. This loneliness was clean, honest. I was alone because I was actually alone, not because I was surrounded by people who refused to see me as human. I started volunteering at a local children's library, reading stories to kids Mason's age, trying to channel my maternal instincts into something productive. But every dark-haired little boy reminded me of him. Every child who reached for my hand after story time took me back to bedtime rituals in a mansion I'd never see again. Then, 3 months after I'd left, something unexpected happened. Mason found me. The children's library where I volunteered was having a Saturday reading event, and I was in the middle of acting out Where the Wild Things Are when I saw a familiar face in the crowd. Mason was sitting in the back row with a woman I didn't recognize. Not Veronica, someone older, kinder looking. Our eyes met across the room, and the month of careful emotional reconstruction I'd been working on crumbled instantly. His face lit up with a joy I hadn't seen since before the Paris trip, and he started to stand up, probably to run to me, but the woman beside him gently pulled him back down. After the reading session ended and the other children had scattered back to their parents, Mason walked over to me slowly, as if he wasn't sure I was really there. The woman followed behind him, her expression curious but not unkind. "Miss Claudia?" His voice was smaller than I remembered, uncertain in a way that broke my heart all over again. "Hi, sweetheart." I knelt down to his level, fighting every instinct that wanted to pull him into my arms. "How are you?" "I missed you." The words came out in a rush, 3 simple words that carried the weight of 3 months of separation and confusion. "I missed you too, more than you know." The woman stepped forward then, extending her hand with a warm smile. "I'm Helen Martinez, Mason's new nanny. He talks about you constantly." New nanny. Of course there was a new nanny. Children like Mason couldn't be left to raise themselves, no matter how emotionally absent their parents were. Someone had to do the actual work of caring for him. "Mason," Helen said gently, "why don't you tell Miss Claudia about your school project while I get us some juice boxes from the cafe?" She left us alone at one of the small tables, surrounded by picture books and the lingering scent of childhood. Crayons and goldfish crackers and that indefinable smell of innocence. Mason scooted his chair closer to mine, his small hand reaching for mine like it had 1,000 times before. "Are you coming home?" he asked, his green eyes wide with hope. Home. The word hit me like a physical blow. The Hampton Mansion had never been my home, but it had been the place where I'd lived my most important work, where I'd loved and been loved in return. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that sometimes loving someone means leaving them? "I can't come back, Mason, but I'm so glad to see you. You've gotten taller." "Are you mad at me? Is that why you left?" The question shattered what was left of my composure. This sweet boy had been carrying guilt that wasn't his to bear, blaming himself for adult decisions that had nothing to do with his worth or behavior. "Oh, sweetheart, no. I'm not mad at you. I could never be mad at you. Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements that have nothing to do with children. You didn't do anything wrong." Helen returned with juice boxes and a gentle announcement that they needed to head home soon. Mason's face fell, the prospect of another goodbye clearly devastating him. "Can we see each other again?" he asked, his voice small and hopeful. I looked at Helen, silently asking for guidance. She nodded thoughtfully. "I think we could arrange that. Maybe we could meet at the park sometimes. I'll need to check with your parents, of course." Parents? The people who'd hired Helen to replace me, who'd moved on from my termination as easily as they'd move on from a failed investment or underperforming stock. But maybe, if Helen could be an ally, there might be a way to maintain some connection with Mason without threatening anyone's authority or pride. Over the next few weeks, Helen and I worked out a careful arrangement. She was a lovely woman in her 40s, a grandmother herself, who understood the bond I'd formed with Mason and respected it rather than feeling threatened by it. We'd meet at Lincoln Park on Saturday afternoons, giving Mason a few hours with me while maintaining appropriate boundaries. Those Saturday visits became the highlight of my week. Mason would race toward me across the playground, his face bright with joy, and for a few hours we'd pretend that nothing had changed. We'd feed the ducks by the pond, play on the swings, share ice cream from the vendor who still remembered his favorite flavor, strawberry with rainbow sprinkles. But I could see the changes in him, the ways that 3 months of transition and loss had marked his spirit. He was more withdrawn, less trusting, quicker to assume that good things wouldn't last. The light in his eyes was dimmer, and sometimes I'd catch him studying me with an expression too serious for his age, as if he was trying to memorize my face in case I disappeared again. Helen filled me in on the household dynamics during our brief conversations while Mason played. Richard was busier than ever, his investment portfolio requiring constant attention as the cryptocurrency market fluctuated wildly. He'd made several $1 million in Bitcoin investments, then lost half of it in a market crash, then made it back again through strategic trades. The financial success was thrilling, but it demanded even more of his time and attention. Veronica had settled into her role as society wife with enthusiasm, her charity work becoming more prominent and time-consuming. She was on the board of 3 different organizations now, her calendar packed with luncheons and galas and fundraising events. She treated Mason politely but distantly, more like a house guest than a stepson. "He asks about you every day," Helen told me one Saturday while Mason built sandcastles at the lakeshore. "He keeps your picture in his bedroom, the one from last Christmas. Sometimes I hear him talking to it before bedtime." The image of Mason whispering to a photograph of me, trying to maintain some connection to the love he'd lost, was almost too painful to bear. I'd done the only thing I could do, spoken up for his emotional needs, but the consequences had fallen hardest on him. As spring turned to summer, our Saturday visits became a cherished routine. Mason grew more comfortable with the arrangement, less desperate and clingy, more able to enjoy the time we had without constantly worrying about when it would end. But I could see that the fundamental damage to his ability to trust was ongoing. He was learning, at 7 years old, that people you love can be taken away without warning or explanation. Then, in early July, everything changed again. Helen called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice tight with concern. "Claudia, something's happened. There's been an incident at the house and Mason is asking for you. I know this is outside our normal arrangement, but could you possibly come over?" An incident. My mind immediately went to worst-case scenarios: accident, illness, emergency. Of course. What happened? Is Mason hurt? He's not hurt physically, but he's very upset. Richard and Veronica had a fight, a bad one. Mason witnessed some things that, well, he shouldn't have seen. He's locked himself in his bedroom and won't come out. He keeps asking for you. I was in my car within 5 minutes, driving through Chicago traffic toward the Gold Coast mansion I'd sworn I'd never enter again. Helen met me at the service entrance, her expression grim. "Thank you for coming. I know this is awkward, but Mason needs someone he trusts right now." She led me through the familiar halls, past the crystal chandeliers and marble floors that had been the backdrop to 6 years of my life. The house felt different somehow, colder, more hollow, as if the pretense of family warmth had finally been stripped away completely. Mason's bedroom door was locked, just as Helen had said. I could hear him crying inside, soft, heartbroken sobs that transported me instantly back to the night I'd found him under the staircase. "Mason, it's Miss Claudia," I said softly, pressing my palm against the door. "Can you let me in?" "Sweetheart." The crying stopped immediately. Then came the sound of small feet running across the floor, the click of the lock turning, and suddenly Mason was in my arms, clinging to me with desperate intensity. "I knew you'd come," he whispered against my shoulder. "I knew you'd come if I needed you." I held him close, breathing in the familiar scent of his strawberry shampoo, feeling his small body shake with residual sobs. Over his head, I could see his bedroom, still decorated with the superhero theme I'd helped him choose 3 years ago, but somehow looking sadder, more neglected. "What happened, baby? Helen said there was some yelling?" Mason pulled back to look at me, his green eyes red from crying. Daddy and Veronica were fighting really loud. She was saying mean things about Daddy's money, and he was saying mean things about her friends. Then she threw something and it broke, and there was glass everywhere. I guided him to sit on his bed, keeping my arm around him protectively. That must have been very scary. And then Veronica said she was leaving, and Daddy said he didn't care, and she said mean things about me too. His voice dropped to a whisper. She said I was the reason she couldn't be happy here. The words hit me like a physical blow. This was what I'd been afraid of, what I'd tried to prevent by advocating for Mason's emotional needs. The adults in his life were so consumed with their own conflicts that they were willing to damage a child to score points against each other. Mason, listen to me very carefully. None of this is your fault. Adults sometimes say cruel things when they're angry, but that doesn't make those things true. You are not responsible for anyone else's happiness or unhappiness. But what if she leaves? What if Daddy leaves too? What if everyone leaves like you did? The fear in his voice was primal, the terror of abandonment that had been building in him since I'd been forced out of his life. He'd already lost his birth mother, then lost me, and now he was facing the possibility of losing his stepmother and father, too. At 7 years old, his world felt perpetually unstable, built on quicksand rather than solid ground. I didn't leave because I wanted to, I told him gently. I left because I had to. But even when people have to leave, the love doesn't go anywhere. The love stays forever. We sat together in his room for an hour, talking about feelings and fears, about the difference between adult problems and child problems, about ways to feel safe even when the world feels scary. It was a conversation no 7-year-old should have to have, but Mason was already wise beyond his years, aged by experiences that should have been far beyond his understanding. Helen appeared in the doorway eventually, her expression sympathetic. "Claudia, Richard wants to speak with you. He's in his study." The prospect of facing Richard after 4 months of separation filled me with dread, but I couldn't leave without addressing the situation that had caused Mason such distress. I tucked him into bed, promising to come say goodbye before I left, and followed Helen down the familiar hallway to Richard's study. He looked older than I remembered, more worn down. His expensive suit was wrinkled. His usually perfectly styled hair disheveled. The study itself looked like a hurricane had passed through. Papers scattered across the floor, a broken crystal decanter glittering in pieces near the fireplace, the scent of expensive whiskey hanging heavy in the air. "Claudia." He didn't look up from his desk where he was staring at stock market reports through his phone. "Thank you for coming. Mason was... He needed someone who loves him," I finished quietly. "Someone he trusts." Richard looked up at me then, and I was surprised to see something that looked almost like shame in his eyes. "The situation got out of hand tonight. Veronica and we said things we shouldn't have said in front of Mason. You said things you shouldn't have said at all. That little boy thinks he's responsible for your unhappiness. He thinks he's the reason Veronica might leave. Veronica is leaving." Richard's voice was flat, defeated. "She's filing for divorce. She says this life isn't what she signed up for, that Mason requires too much attention, that she can't compete with a dead woman for my affections." I felt a complex mix of emotions, relief that Mason might be freed from Veronica's cold indifference, but also fear about what another major upheaval would do to his already fragile sense of security. What does this mean for Mason? It means he'll be better off without someone who sees him as an obstacle to her happiness. Richard stood up from behind his desk, walking to the window that overlooked Lincoln Park. "Claudia, I need to ask you something. I know how I treated you was wrong. I know I made mistakes in how I handled your concerns about Mason's emotional needs." An apology. After 4 months of silence, after terminating me via text message, after dismissing my 6 years of devotion as overstepping boundaries. "You were right," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "about everything. Mason has been struggling since you left. Helen is wonderful, but she's not you. She didn't raise him from the time he was 4 years old. She doesn't know his favorite bedtime story or how to chase away his nightmares about dinosaurs." I stood there in that opulent study, surrounded by the trappings of wealth that had never been able to buy what Mason truly needed, and felt decades of hurt and anger rising to the surface. But I also felt something else, a door opening, a possibility I hadn't dared to hope for. "What are you asking me?" "Richard, I'm asking if you'd consider coming back, not as just a nanny, but as family. You've earned that. Mason needs that. I need that." Family. The word I'd been denied for 6 years, offered now in a moment of crisis and vulnerability. Part of me wanted to refuse, to make him feel even a fraction of the abandonment I'd experienced. But Mason's face appeared in my mind, tear-streaked and hopeful, trusting me to come when he needed me most. "I'll need some conditions," I said finally. "Anything. I want a contract that specifies my role in Mason's emotional development, not just his physical care. I want a voice in decisions that affect his well-being. I want respect for the relationship I've built with him over 6 years. Richard nodded eagerly. "Of course. Anything you want. And I want an apology. A real one. Not because you need me back, but because you owe me one." He turned from the window to face me fully, and for the first time in all the years I'd known him, Richard Hampton looked truly humbled. "Claudia, I am deeply sorry. I was wrong to dismiss your concerns about Mason. I was wrong to fire you without a proper conversation. I was wrong to treat you as if your love for my son was somehow inappropriate instead of recognizing it as the gift it was. You gave us everything, and I threw it away because of my own pride and insecurity. I'm sorry." The apology hung in the air between us like a bridge, connecting 6 years of hurt to the possibility of healing. It wasn't enough to erase the damage that had been done, but it was a beginning. "I need time to think about this," I said. "This isn't a decision I can make lightly." "Of course. Take all the time you need. But Claudia, Mason needs you. I need you. This family needs you." I left that night without giving an answer, but with something I hadn't had in 4 months: hope. The drive back to my small apartment in Rogers Park felt different, charged with possibility and uncertainty in equal measure. Over the next week, I wrestled with the decision. Sarah called from California, worried about my considering a return to those people who treated you so badly. Helen called too, offering her perspective on Mason's current state and the household dynamics she'd observed. "He's a different child when you're around," Helen told me. "Lighter, more confident. I can provide good basic care, but what you have with him, that's irreplaceable." But it was Mason himself who ultimately made the decision for me. Helen arranged for him to call me one evening, and his small voice over the phone carried a weight of longing that broke my heart. "Miss Claudia, are you coming home?" Home. That word again, spoken by the one person who had the power to make it true. "Would you like me to come home, sweetheart?" "Yes, please come home. I promise I'll be good. I promise I won't have bad dreams. I promise—" "Mason, stop," I interrupted gently. "You don't have to promise to be anything other than exactly who you are. You're perfect just the way you are." "Then will you come back?" "Yes, baby, I'll come back." The conversation that followed with Richard was different from any we'd had before. Instead of me sitting across from his imposing desk while he wielded his authority like a weapon, we sat in the living room as equals, negotiating terms that would protect both Mason's needs and my dignity. The contract we drew up was unlike any nanny agreement I'd ever seen. It specified my role in Mason's emotional development, my authority to make decisions about his daily routine and activities, my right to advocate for his needs without fear of retaliation. It also included a substantial raise and benefits package that reflected my value to the family. More importantly, it included language that recognized me officially as a permanent member of the Hampton household, with all the respect and consideration that entailed. I would no longer be just the help. The day I moved back into the Gold Coast mansion felt like coming home and starting over simultaneously. Mason was beside himself with joy, following me from room to room as I unpacked, as if he was afraid I might disappear again if he let me out of his sight. "Are you staying forever this time?" he asked, sitting on my bed while I hung up my clothes. "I'm planning to stay for as long as you need me," I told him, "as long as you want me here. I'll always want you here. Always and forever and infinity." Always and forever and infinity. The mathematics of a 7-year-old's love, boundless and eternal in a way that adults often forgotten how to feel. The transition back into the household was smoother than I'd expected. Helen stayed on for 2 weeks to help with the adjustment, and her presence made the handoff feel collaborative rather than competitive. She genuinely cared about Mason's well-being, and she was relieved to see him happier and more secure. Richard kept his word about treating me as family rather than staff. I was included in decisions about Mason's schooling, his extracurricular activities, his social development. When Mason had parent-teacher conferences, both Richard and I attended. When he had friends over for playdates, I was introduced as Miss Claudia, who's like family rather than the nanny. The changes in Mason were remarkable and swift. The nightmares that had plagued him during my absence disappeared within days of my return. His appetite improved, his energy returned, his natural curiosity and humor reasserted themselves. It was as if he'd been holding his breath for 4 months and could finally exhale. But perhaps the most significant change was in Richard himself. The crisis with Veronica, the near loss of Mason's emotional stability, the recognition of how badly he'd mishandled my original termination. All of it had forced him to confront his priorities in a way that success in business never had. He began spending more time at home, making an effort to be present for Mason's bedtime routine, joining us for dinner instead of eating alone in his study. The conversations we'd had about Mason's emotional needs had clearly resonated because Richard started asking questions about child development, about ways to connect with his son beyond providing financial security. "I think I was afraid," he admitted to me one evening after Mason had gone to bed. Afraid that if I got too attached, I might lose him the way I lost his mother. It was easier to focus on work, on financial success, on things I could control. "But Mason isn't an investment portfolio," I replied gently. "You can't love him from a distance and expect dividends. Children need presence, not just presence." The divorce proceedings with Veronica were messy and expensive, but they were also liberating. She'd signed a prenuptial agreement that limited her claim on Richard's assets, but she fought for everything she could get: alimony, a settlement that would maintain her lifestyle, even claims on some of Richard's cryptocurrency holdings. Mason handled the divorce better than anyone expected, probably because Veronica's departure removed a source of tension and coldness from his daily environment. He asked questions about why she'd left, but they came from curiosity rather than devastation. She'd never been a real stepmother to him, so her absence didn't leave the kind of void that my departure had created. As the months passed, our little family of 3 found its rhythm. Richard's business continued to thrive. His real estate investments were performing exceptionally well, his tech stock portfolio was generating impressive returns, and his early cryptocurrency investments had made him one of Chicago's wealthiest individuals under 45. But the success felt different now, more balanced, because it wasn't consuming his entire identity. Mason flourished in ways that went beyond academic achievement or social development. He became more confident, more outgoing, more willing to try new things because he had a secure base of love and support to return to. His artwork became brighter and more optimistic. His stories about his day at school were filled with excitement rather than anxiety. He started talking about the future in terms of possibilities rather than fears. One evening in late October, almost exactly a year after that night, I'd found Mason crying beneath the staircase. We were all in the living room together. Richard was reading while Mason and I worked on a puzzle, the fire crackling in the fireplace, the first snow of the season dusting the windows that looked out over Lincoln Park. "Miss Claudia?" Mason said, his voice thoughtful in the way that usually preceded important questions. "Are we a real family now?" The question hung in the warm air of that elegant room, heavy with meaning and hope. Richard looked up from his book, his eyes meeting mine with an expression I'd never seen before. Gratitude, respect, love, and something deeper. Recognition, maybe. Acknowledgement of what we'd built together. "What do you think makes a real family?" I asked Mason, continuing to sort puzzle pieces while my heart raced. "I think a real family is people who love each other and take care of each other and stay together even when things get hard." "Then yes, sweetheart, we're definitely a real family." Richard cleared his throat softly. "Mason, there's something I've been meaning to talk to both of you about. I've been thinking about making some changes, legal ones, that would make our family official." Mason looked up from the puzzle, confused. "What kind of changes?" Richard set down his book and moved to sit closer to us on the floor, his expensive business suit incongruous with the domestic scene, but somehow perfect too. "Well, I was thinking that maybe Miss Claudia would like to adopt you legally, and maybe I could adopt her as my... well, as Mason's second mother, as family." Adoption. Legal recognition of what had already existed in our hearts for years. The idea was so overwhelming, so unexpected that I couldn't speak for a moment. "You mean Miss Claudia would really be my mom?" Mason's voice was filled with wonder and excitement. "If she wants to be," Richard said, looking at me with an expression that was both hopeful and nervous. "If she's willing to take on a ready-made family with all our complications and quirks." I looked at these two people who'd become my whole world. The little boy I'd loved from the moment I met him, the father who'd learned to value love over profits, and realized that this wasn't just about legal documents or official recognition. This was about choosing each other, formally and permanently, in a way that honored the bonds we'd already built. "Yes," I whispered, then clearer. "Yes, I would love that more than anything." Mason launched himself into my arms, nearly knocking over the puzzle in his enthusiasm. "Really? Really truly? You'll really be my mom forever?" "Really truly. Forever and always and infinity." The legal adoption process took several months, but they were months filled with anticipation and joy, rather than the uncertainty and fear that had marked so much of our journey together. Richard hired the best family lawyers in Chicago, determined to make the process as smooth as possible. I signed papers and attended meetings and underwent background checks that felt redundant given how thoroughly Richard already knew my character and commitment. But more importantly, we spent those months building the kind of family dynamic that would support our new legal status. Richard continued to grow as a father, learning to balance his business success with emotional presence. I settled into my role as not just Mason's caregiver, but as an equal partner in his upbringing. Mason bloomed under the security of knowing that the two adults he loved most in the world were committed to him and to each other permanently. The formal adoption ceremony was held in a Chicago courthouse on a bright spring day, with Mason dressed in his best suit and clutching a bouquet of flowers he'd insisted on bringing for his new mom. The judge who presided over the ceremony was a kind woman in her 60s who clearly understood the significance of what we were formalizing. "This is unusual," she noted, looking over our paperwork. "Most adoption cases involve married couples or single parents adopting children. But what we have here is a family that's choosing to formalize bonds that already exist, recognizing relationships that have been built through love and commitment rather than biology or law." She was right. We weren't creating a family that day. We were simply making official what had been true in our hearts for years. When the judge asked Mason if he understood what adoption meant, he stood up straight and answered with the seriousness of someone much older than 8. "It means that Miss Claudia will be my real mom forever, and nobody can take her away from me ever again." Nobody can take her away ever again. The security he'd been craving, the permanence he'd been afraid to hope for, finally guaranteed by law and witnessed by the state of Illinois. The celebration afterward was small but perfect. Just the three of us at Mason's favorite restaurant, followed by ice cream in Lincoln Park, where we'd spent so many Saturday afternoons during my exile. As we sat on a bench watching Mason play on the swings, Richard turned to me with an expression of profound contentment. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For saving us, for saving him, for saving me from becoming the kind of father who provides everything except what matters most." The years that followed were filled with the ordinary magic of family life. School plays where both parents sat beaming in the audience, birthday parties where love mattered more than expensive decorations, quiet evenings when homework and bedtime stories felt like the most important work in the world. Richard's business continued to thrive, his wealth growing through strategic investments and smart business decisions. But the money remained a tool rather than a master, providing security and opportunity without consuming his soul. He funded scholarships for children from single-parent families, donated to organizations that supported caregivers and domestic workers, and used his success to create positive change rather than just accumulate assets. Mason grew into a confident, compassionate teenager who understood both privilege and responsibility. The early trauma of abandonment and neglect had left some scars, but they were scars that had healed cleanly, reminders of pain overcome, rather than wounds that continued to bleed. Most importantly, he grew up understanding that love wasn't conditional or temporary, that the adults in his life were committed to his well-being, not because they had to be, but because they chose to be, every single day. And I grew too. From a woman who defined herself entirely through service to others, I became someone who understood that loving others and valuing myself weren't mutually exclusive. The respect and recognition that Richard and Mason gave me wasn't just professional courtesy. It was acknowledgement of my worth as a human being, my value as a member of their family. Now, as I sit in my comfortable chair in our Gold Coast home, yes, our home, because that's what it truly became, I often think about that night so many years ago when I found Mason crying beneath the staircase. I think about the path that led us from that moment of broken crisis to this moment of quiet contentment. Sometimes the most profound journeys begin with the smallest acts of love. Kneeling beside a frightened child, speaking truth when silence would be easier, choosing love over security, forgiveness over resentment. Sometimes the family you're meant to have isn't the one you were born into, but the one you choose to build, piece by piece, through commitment and care, and the daily decision to show up for each other. Mason is in college now, studying business and social work, planning a career that will let him use his family's financial resources to help other children who need advocates and love. He calls me Mom without hesitation, introduces me as his mother with pride, includes me in every important moment of his life, not because he has to, but because he can't imagine it any other way. Richard and I never married. Our relationship remained a partnership focused on Mason's well-being rather than romantic attachment. But we became family in every way that matters. He respected my autonomy while valuing my contribution, supported my growth while appreciating my sacrifice, and most importantly, never again made me feel invisible or disposable. The Gold Coast mansion that once felt like an elegant prison became a true home, filled with laughter and arguments and celebrations and quiet moments that form the foundation of authentic family life. The marble floors witnessed first steps and graduation parties. The crystal chandeliers illuminated homework sessions and heart-to-heart conversations. The grand staircase where I once found a broken little boy became the backdrop for prom photos and family portraits. But perhaps the most important change was in my understanding of my own worth. For years, I'd measured my value entirely through my usefulness to others, how well I could anticipate needs, meet expectations, provide comfort without expecting anything in return. The Hampton family taught me that love isn't just about giving, it's also about receiving, about allowing others to value you as much as you value them. I learned that speaking up for yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. That demanding respect isn't ungrateful, it's healthy. That walking away from people who diminish your humanity isn't cruel, it's self-preservation. Most importantly, I learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is teaching them how to treat you properly, even if that lesson comes at great personal cost. The journey wasn't easy or straightforward. There were setbacks and conflicts, moments when old patterns threatened to reassert themselves, times when the weight of past hurt made forward progress seem impossible. But love, real love, isn't defeated by difficulty. It's strengthened by it. Every challenge we faced together made our bonds stronger rather than weaker. Every crisis we weathered proved that our commitment to each other was genuine rather than conditional. Every small victory, a successful parent-teacher conference, a birthday celebration where Mason felt truly seen and valued, a quiet evening when Richard chose family time over business calls, reinforced the foundation we were building together. Now, as I watch Mason prepare for his final year of college, as I see Richard find meaning and satisfaction in being present for the people he loves rather than just successful in the metrics that society values, as I experience the deep contentment of a life lived with purpose and recognition, I understand that our story isn't just about one family's journey from brokenness to healing. It's about the power of love that refuses to be dismissed or diminished. It's about the courage required to speak truth to people who have power over your security. It's about the patience necessary to wait for justice while continuing to act with compassion. It's about the wisdom to recognize that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with anger or resentment, but with persistent, uncompromising love. For every woman who has loved someone else's child as her own, who has given her heart to people who took it for granted, who has been dismissed as just the help while providing the foundation that holds families together, this story is for you. Your love matters. Your sacrifice has value. Your voice deserves to be heard. For every person who has felt invisible in spaces where their contribution was essential, who has been made to feel grateful for scraps when they deserved abundance, who has been told that their expectations were too high when they were simply asking to be treated with basic human dignity. You are seen, you are valued, and you deserve better. And for everyone who has ever wondered whether love is enough to overcome systemic inequality, whether persistence can really triumph over prejudice, whether it's possible to maintain your humanity while fighting for your rights, yes, it is possible. It requires cost, but it's possible. The little boy I found crying beneath that staircase grew up to be a man who understands that wealth without love is poverty, that success without connection is emptiness, that having everything means nothing if you can't share it with people who matter. He learned those lessons not from textbooks or business courses, but from watching adults choose each other, fight for each other, and commit to showing up for each other even when it was difficult. He learned that families aren't just created by biology or law. They're built by choice, sustained by commitment, and strengthened by the daily decision to value each other's well-being above your own comfort. The mansion in Chicago's Gold Coast still stands, still perfect from the outside, still reflecting the success and privilege of its owners. But inside, it has been transformed from a museum of wealth into a home filled with love. The marble floors now bear the scuff marks of real life. The crystal chandeliers illuminate moments of genuine joy, and the grand staircase where our journey began has become a symbol of ascension rather than descent. And I am still here, still caring for the people I love, still fighting for children who need advocates, still believing that love, persistent, patient, uncompromising love, can change the world one family at a time. Have you ever found yourself loving someone else's child as if they were your own? Have you ever had to choose between speaking up for what's right and protecting your own security? Have you ever walked away from a situation where you were undervalued, only to discover that your absence made others realize your true worth? Tell me your story in the comments below. Share your experience of love that transcends legal definitions, of courage that costs everything but gains even more, of the long journey from invisible service to recognized family. If this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe. It helps us reach other women who need to hear that their love and sacrifice matter, that their voices deserve to be heard, that their stories have value. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special podcast filled with more stories of love, loss, redemption, and the quiet heroism of people who care for others. You can find it by clicking on the left. Thank you for joining me on this journey of the heart. Thank you for witnessing the transformation of pain into purpose, of separation into reunion, of a house into a home. Thank you for believing that love, in the end, really can triumph over everything that tries to diminish it. Until we meet again in the next story, remember that you matter, your love matters, and someone somewhere needs exactly what you have to give.